Hey, good morning. Happy Advent. Message is brought to you by the House of David Bible News. Urgent. Read all about it. Who were they? Personally, I used to say they were doctors and lawyers, but let's find out. The Pharisees and Sadducees. Who were they? There were a variety of different factions in Jerusalem, all opposed to Jesus. The most notable of which were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees, they played an important role in the religious life of the people. They strictly avoided contact with anything which could make them ritually impure. They exercised great care in the matters of ritual purity, in food laws and Sabbath law. Their piety centered around the study of biblical law, in the course of which they had built up a body of traditional interpretation called the oral law, which tended to assume an important role equal to that of the written law itself. The Pharisees enjoyed considerable popular prestige. This was partly because many of them originally came from humble backgrounds, unlike the Sadducean aristocracy, and partly because they had not been afraid to make a stand for their principles. For examples, they did not shrink from publicly opposing Herod the Great when he trampled on the tradition of the Jewish ways, even though this cost many of them their lives, as when they were removed, when the figure of the eagle which Herod had set up over the entrance of the temple, but which they considered to be idolatrous. Since they were under the Roman domination, they had resisted popular movements of revolt, preferring rather to cooperate with the Roman authorities, but only as long as this ensured them religious liberty. The Sadduceans, on the other hand, were a priestly party who emerged into prominence like the Pharisees and the time of the Maccabees about 167 BC. But whereas the Pharisees were first and foremost a religious group, the Sadducees were also a political party. They were essentially aristocratic, many of them possessing considerable wealth and lands, and inclined them to a policy of cooperating with the Roman authorities and preserving the status quo. This conservative political approach did not endear them to the mass of populace who felt that the Pharisees would be more likely to support their interests. In their religious view, the Sadducees were conservative, placing great stress on the 5 books of the Law of Moses, of which they considered themselves to be official interpreters, and thus they rejected the book of oral law, which the Pharisees had built. A further major disagreement with the Pharisees arose because the Sadducees denied any doctrine of a future resurrection of the body, which they said could not be found in the law, whereas the Pharisees held strongly to a belief in a final resurrection. And it was on this question of future resurrection that the Sadducees also had caused to clash with Jesus. It says Mark chapter 12, verse 18 through 27. Urgent news. The Festival of Tabernacles was one of 3 major festivals of the Jewish religious year. The festival was originally intended as a reminder of the Exodus from Egypt, but in the New Testament times, it had additional significance of being a time of prayers for rain. Prayers for rain after the dry summer months. Furthermore, it was probably a time when thoughts and prayers were particularly directed at the coming of the Messiah. Jesus' statement in the temple must be seen in the light of these Masonic aspirations. Jesus' visit to Caesarea Philippi represented an important turning point in Jesus' ministry. The disciples at last firmly acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, but he began to explain to them that his Masonic role was completely different from what they had expected. Suffering and death were essential to bringing in God's kingdom. Jesus rejected the idea of a triumphant military figure, interpreting his mission in the light of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7.